Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. Greetings to you all. If you're joining us for the first time or you are joining us again, having joined us from the beginning, we're so grateful that you are here. Today, I have a few announcements to give to you all before we get into our expert series. Our experts are ready, and this is going to be a fantastic experience. First off, we are in a new quarter, and as DPO Africa Network, we plan our activities per quarter. And I want to introduce to you one of our amazing release from our last quarter. And here is the DPO Africa Network. If you haven't gotten a copy of one of these, please use the link in the chat button to go read, reflect, and understand where we're coming from and the bold moves that we are set to make in this new quarter. We welcome you to join the movement. So as you come in, please engage and join the movement. We are growing as a network. Yes, the numbers have been amazing. On LinkedIn, we have over 2,000 followers. Inside the network, we have over 1,000 learners and members, and also our volunteer group is growing, over 200. In fact, we've introduced WhatsApp so that we can get away from the algorithm and people can get the notifications for our event as soon as we post them. That's not all. Another exciting thing is with growth, it means we need additional hands to help us serve you all better. That said, we've expanded our leadership team, and I'm excited to introduce to you our group leads who will be leading us in this quarter. We have Princess from Botswana, Lorato. We have Prince who will be leading today's session and moderating it. Rusa, who will be driving the meetup group. Laura will be behind our community engagement, and Irene will be working closely with me around all things program management. Indeed, exciting times ahead, and we welcome you to get involved. This is a place for leaders. But beyond that, we want to ensure that your voices are heard. And so we have our office hours, which is going to be every Friday, where you come in with your questions and thinking of how to get engaged. This is a place for you. Drop in. In fact, we're having one after today's session. So drop in 30 minutes after today's session, we will be having our office hour. Not just that, we also will be having our DPO meetup where we have practical challenges. We want you to come. It's going to be a peer-to-peer brainstorming session, and you might be surprised at the insights that you will get just from shared perspective of every other person who will be on there. So submit your questions, your challenges ahead of time, and who knows, it might be your challenge that we will be reviewing at the end of the month. And of course, you can do that by indicating you want to be anonymous while submitting so we don't refer to you. Not just that, for volunteers, we welcome you all to volunteer. In this quarter, we're looking at data subject right across the continent, starting with about 12 countries. So come in, let your voice be heard, come make an impact in the group, because this is a place where we can drive true engagement. Awesome. I know a number of you might be asking, I want to empower myself. I want to elevate my skill. Yes, we've got you covered. At DPO Africa, we have 2 courses for you, of course. The courses that we have is the Data Protection Foundation course, and we also have the Data Protection Practitioner course. The foundation is for reviewing, doing privacy reviews end to end. And with the practitioner course, if you're a DPO, this is it for you, program management and the like. So we want to see you in class so that we can have structured way of learning. And as we go amplifying excellence across the continent, you will be one of the leaders who would be exemplifying this. We are firmly aware of the financial barriers that can limit people from participating in this program. And because of that, with our courses, we're opening up a form of donation where you can donate to sponsor an aspiring DPO. Our commitment is to match every dollar so that we can be sustainable and ensure that a number of aspiring DPOs would have the opportunity and access to join us. So please come on in and partner in change. Every contribution matters. However, beyond that, I know you are eager to jump into today's webinar session, and I want to thank you. One last thing is we are starting a new data trust drive. This drive is for us to go outside of this community where we are out there online to drive awareness of what we're doing within this network. And so if you're interested, you've got a huge following, you want to join me on that, send us an email, info@dpoafrica.net. I want you to come alongside with me. We're going to be looking at amazing topics on privacy harms on the continent, how a solo DPO can empower themselves all of that awareness, we're taking it out there so that we can bring more people into the network, because with a richer perspective, you will be able to do your job effectively. With that said, I'd like to introduce our moderator for today so that we can get this event started. So join me to welcome Prince. I will bring Prince on stage right now. Okay, Prince is going to come on stage to introduce to us our panelists, and I will also bring on stage Rose and Amarachi. Prince, please take it away.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, Navigating the Nuances of Transborder Privacy Issues in Africa. My name is Prince Jones, and I'm joining you from Zimbabwe to serve as your moderator today. In today's interconnected world, organizations face increasing challenges in managing personal data across multiple jurisdictions. With evolving regulatory landscapes, understanding how to navigate cross-border data transfers is critical to compliance and robust data governance. I'm delighted to introduce our distinguished panelists, Dr. Amarachi Utah, Director of Privacy for North and Latin America at Ericsson, joining us from the United States and originally from Nigeria. And Rose Mosero, Data Protection and Cybersecurity Advisor to the East African community, and joining us from Kenya. Thank you all for being here. Let's dive into today's crucial discussion on cross-border privacy in Africa. Here's what to expect from today's session. Each panelist will have 1 minute to introduce themselves and share a quick overview of what they'll be unpacking during their talk. Following introductions, each will deliver a focused 15-minute presentation diving deep into critical aspects of transborder privacy issues in Africa. After the presentations, all panelists will return on stage for a live panel discussion. This is your opportunity to engage. Please drop your questions in the chat at any time, and we'll do our best to address them during the discussion. As always, we have special surprises lined up for everyone attending live. So please don't miss the ending. We're looking forward to an engaging, insightful session, so let's get started. I believe Dr. Amarachi should be coming on.
Hi, Prince. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for that introduction. Amaka, I think you are in charge of our presentation. I don't see it yet. There we go. All right. I think we need to enlarge it. Perfect. Okay. Do you want to have, because we just had it as, we had ourselves as thumbnails and the presentation a bit bigger. Is there a way to, or this is fine? If this is fine, I can push ahead. I can see perfectly just to make sure everybody else can see. So my name is Amarachi Uta. Perfect, yeah, there we go. My name is Amarachi Uta. I work as the Director for Privacy for North and Latin America at Ericsson. I'm based in the Dallas area here in the US. And I've worked in the data policy, law, and regulatory space for quite a while now, for a little over 15 years. And today I will be focusing the first part of the presentation, my part of the presentation, before I hand over to my colleague Rose, on sort of drawing the linkages between what we all recognize in Africa as digital transformation and the economic growth connected to that, and data privacy regulation. And then I'll hand over to my colleague Rose, who will dive a bit deeper into the actual regulation and some of the questions and the issues around harmonization and differences from country to country within the continent. So let me stop here, and I guess, Rose, you would also be introducing yourself at this point before I dive into my part of the presentation.
Wonderful. Hope you can all see me and hear me. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening from whichever part of the world that you are. My name is Rose Mosero. I presently act as the data protection and cybersecurity expert advisor to the East African community on a project known as the Eastern Africa Regional Digital Integration Project, which effectively seeks to bring together the Eastern African countries in aligning their digital transformation agenda, but also their practices to ensure that there's a single digital market. I previously worked at the Office of the Data Protection Commissioner, which is a regulator in Kenya. I served as their first deputy commissioner dealing with compliance matters. So I'm really looking forward to discussing transborder or cross-border data flows, and I'll pass it on to back to Amarachi, and we look forward to this engagement. Thank you.
Thank you, Rose. So Amaka, I think right now the presentation has switched to the thumbnail. So I don't know if there's a way to switch it back to the main screen. Perfect. Thank you. Thanks so much. So conversations about African economic growth have evolved significantly over different periods, right? From early development economics conversations in the 1960s and 70s to conversation around structural adjustments, discussions in the 80s and the 90s, to more recent conversations around sustainable development, right? That's sort of a buzzword in the African economic development space. And Africa's economic transition and transformation in the 2000s and beyond has largely been focused on this notion of sustainable development. And today, it's almost impossible to engage in a conversation around economic growth in Africa without an exploration of digital transformation as a key driver of significant economic opportunity in Africa. And these economic opportunities have largely been motivated by a number of critical levers, most notably those associated with digital infrastructure development, whether you're talking about DPIs or DPGs, all resulting in expanded broadband connectivity, expanded mobile networks, increased access to reliable electricity, and all the above, right? And so on this slide, we start by charting the status of digital transformation in Africa using internet penetration as a metric, right? As a proxy variable. And by just looking at the first graph, you start to get a sense of the digital status across the various regions of the continent, right? And in the second map, we start to sort of chart out how this proxy stacks up against GDP growth over the last 15 years. And we demonstrate the correlation between the two variables. And you can immediately start to see that there's a positive relationship, a positive correlation, not causation, right? This is just merely sort of trying to get a sense of how both variables interact, right? And you can see that there's a positive relationship over the last 14 years, 14 to 15 years at least, right? We can see that there is a positive relationship between digital transformation as proxied by internet penetration and economic growth, right? As internet access has increased and has gone up, so has economic growth. Now, of course, there are lots of other factors that contribute to economic growth, but this is just showing the relationship between those two variables. And the graph shows that internet penetration in Africa has steadily increased from 9.6% in 2010 to approximately 43% in 2024. And a 10% increase in internet penetration can be shown to lead to between a 1 to 4% increase in GDP growth across African economies further underscoring the economic importance of expanding internet access across the continent. And the internet's contribution to GDP growth has grown from about 1.1% to 3.7% over this same period, which translates to a potential contribution of over $115 billion, which is about 5% of the overall continental GDP. So these are not numbers to sniff at, right? And so, Amaka, you can move to the next slide. And this transformation has not been limited to a single industry, right? The continent has seen advancements in digital financial services, digital banking, payment systems, fintech, what we all know as fintech, healthcare, health tech, telemedicine, e-health records, mobile health applications, which are a dime a dozen nowadays, largely in more recent times driven by the pandemic, agriculture, market intelligence, supply chain management, precision farming, education, government services, retail and e-commerce, energy, transportation, manufacturing. I mean, it runs the entire sort of spectrum of economic activity. Now, some of us here might be old enough to remember what life was like before everyone had a mobile phone in their hands, right? For most of us, or for some of us, someone like me that grew up in Nigeria, we had NITEL. Grew up in Nigeria in the 70s and 80s. We had NITEL, landlines, right? Which the internet expanded into cyber cafes. And once mobile phones sort of entered the scene, everything changed. And now at the touch of a button, you can send and receive large sums of money from contacts thousands and thousands of miles away, right? We're all familiar with M-Pesa, right? Owned by Safaricom, Kenya's largest telecommunications provider. And it's a mobile money platform that has single-handedly revolutionized financial inclusion, right? And just to give you a sense of the scale of its reach, as of the end of 2024, M-Pesa boasted 34 million plus users in Kenya alone, which is about 61% of the adult population, about 55 million people. And M-Pesa has begun to expand and has continued to expand its reach across the continent, and now has, sort of operations in you name it, DRC, Egypt, Ghana, Lesotho, Mozambique. And it has continued to maintain its status as one of the most successful examples of mobile payment providers in Africa and worldwide, not just in Africa, but across the globe. An incredible success story, right? Driven sort of by this engine of digital transformation that's making its way across the continent. And motivated by the apparent and expanding digital dividends that the continent is experiencing, cross-continental initiatives have sprung up, right? Everything from the African Union's digital transformation strategy, the World Bank's digital economy for African initiatives, DE4A, Smart Africa Alliance made up of 30 member countries, the African Continental Free Trade Area, all of which have the combined goal to expand the pace and the scale of digital transformation across industries, whether it's through the tool of digital IDs, which have the potential to bring 500 plus million people into the formal economy, whether it's through e-commerce, fintech to bring banking to the unbanked, whether it's through blockchain and digital currencies, whether it's through the expansion of 5G networks. There's this overall rise in this notion that digital transformation really and truly does have the power to transform economies across Africa. We can move to the next slide, please, Amaka. So the question then becomes, why do we as privacy professionals care, right? Why do we care about all of this? Why does all this matter? And well, in order to answer that question, we have to come down to sort of the consumer level, right? Because we are, after all, talking about personal data. We care about personal data, right? And what this means for regular people, what you and I would think of as the data subject, what in privacy parlance we will call the data subject, right? And when we explore how people are participating in the digital economy, we find that most people access digital services using their mobile phones. That's what we're showing in this first pie chart, right? And these are devices that are essentially an extension of most people's lives, right? Everything from financial information, health information, biometric information, logs of the most intimate details of personal lives live on people's mobile phones. And for the most part, looking at the next chart, people use their mobile phones for social media engagement, which we all know incorporates a lot of economic activity, information seeking, and access to financial services. In fact, in South Africa, data shows that in South Africa, over 50% of internet users conduct banking, investment, insurance activities all online, all of which reflect the growth and importance of digital financial inclusion. E-commerce has seen remarkable growth, whether you're talking about WhatsApp, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, right? E-commerce, African shoppers are engaging more and more with e-commerce, and the numbers have increased from less than 140 million in 2017 to almost 390 million active engaged users in e-commerce on the continent as of 2022. And we also find that as of 2024, as of last year, 74% of web traffic in Africa was via mobile phones, over 14 percentage points higher than the world average. Now, all of this data, I'm not giving you all of these statistics just to sound fancy, right? I'm saying all of this to highlight the fact that Africa's unique mobile-first approach to internet access has shaped the way we engage with applications, engage with data, right? With particularly strong adoption in areas that involve the use, the sharing, the leveraging of critical pieces of personal data, right? And growth and transformation is happening on the backs of data subjects that are sharing information, which in many cases map out the most critical, the most sensitive aspects of their day-to-day lives. And so when we consider all of this data that's being shared, all of this data that's being leveraged, the question then becomes, as privacy professionals, the question then becomes, who's controlling all this data, right? Who's processing it? Where does it live? Where does it go? And these are the questions that we want to try to begin to explore, but we cannot do this without thinking about how all of this data moves across the continent and what this means for the evolution of data privacy regulation in the region. You can move to the next slide, Amaka. So just to level set, there's no sort of singular agreement on what the definition of transborder data flow is or should be, right? And there's no single definition that's accepted across majority of jurisdictions. And so for the purposes, just to level set for the purposes of this presentation, this is a definition that we're using, right? TDF is the movement, exchange, or flow of personal data between entities across political and geographical boundaries for the purpose of processing or intended processing. Can move to the next slide, please, Amaka. Now, I've shared all these statistics. We know that Africa remains the fastest growing bandwidth market globally, right? With growth at a compound annual rate of 44% between 2019 and 2023. And projections suggest that this exponential rate of growth, compounded growth, will continue, right? Between 2022 and all the way through to 2029. And several factors have contributed to this dramatic increase. I know there's a lot of text here, so I'm just going to summarize with my voiceover. And the growth of the digital economy has fueled the need for cross-border collaboration and ease of communication. And this has incentivized major investments in critical infrastructure. As a result, the number of submarine cables deployed to serve Africa has increased from just 7 in 2008 to 72 active cables today. Cross-border terrestrial fiber networks have doubled, increasing from 465,000 kilometers in 2009 to over 900 kilometers as of 2014. And hyperscalers that we're all familiar with, like Microsoft, the Googles, the Amazons, the Metas, have become major investors in submarine cable infrastructure on the continent. You can move to the next slide, please, Amaka. And we have also seen that a large proportion of this investment is concentrated in key coastal territories, including Nigeria, South Africa, Kenya, Egypt, all of which serve as feeders to the landlocked hinterlands of the continent. Now, what remains a challenge, however, is that the legislative frameworks that govern cross-border data flow were not set up to accommodate the volume, the scale, the complexity of cross-border digital activity that the continent is currently experiencing. For the most part, a lot of these legislative frameworks were drafted with the unique national context in mind, the unique needs of the countries within which they were constructed in mind. And they were not set up to work in harmony with legislative frameworks outside of their sovereign territory. And this is the problem that has brought us to this conversation today. We can move to the next slide, please, Amaka. For example, just to take for example, some of the key markets that we've spoken of that I just mentioned earlier, right? Most African countries with comprehensive privacy regulation stipulate that there must be a basis upon which to transfer personal data across borders, right? And these conditions must be met in addition to general requirements that set out respective regulations, including lawful basis for processing personal data and processing special categories of personal data, sensitive data. And these grounds for transfer can generally be categorized into two, right? Adequacy and everything that's not adequacy, right? Now let's talk about adequacy, right? Each country provides for transfer based on some form of adequate level of protection in the receiving country, right? But there are considerable differences in how adequacy is defined from country to country, right? Now here we've sort of laid out three of the key markets that we've mentioned a few times in the course of this presentation. And take Nigeria, for example. A transfer based on adequacy can occur when the recipient of the personal data is subject to a law, binding corporate rules, contractual clauses, some sort of code of conduct or certification that affords an adequate level of protection to personal data in accordance with the Nigerian regulation, right? And having selected a mechanism for transfer, the data controller must then assess whether the level of protection afforded by the receiving country is adequate for the purposes of the Nigerian regulation. Now, what adequate means is set out by a number of criteria, right? That's defined by a series of factors. Now, hold that in your mind. In South Africa, the regulation is less sort of prescriptive in terms of data transfer, and it provides sort of roundabout language for what is adequate, right? Here, the third party who's the recipient of the information must be subject to a law, also binding corporate rules, which provide an adequate level of protection. Again, there's that language, adequate level of protection. But in South Africa, adequate level of protection is defined by a different set of criteria than what is defined in Nigeria. The same applies in Kenya. Adequacy is determined on sort of a case-by-case basis. And in all cases, the data controller and or processor has to provide the data commissioner with proof that there are appropriate safeguards in place with respect to the security and protection of the personal data. And so with these sort of different layers and different levels of what adequacy means and different requirements, it's really difficult to start to think about how cross-border data transfer can happen in a way that aligns across all these different jurisdictions, aligns with the requirements of privacy regulation across these different jurisdictions. And we also have to consider data localization requirements, which are unique across these different territories and which have been laid out in a bid to protect the digital sovereignty of these different sort of jurisdictions. And so these are, you begin to see sort of the complexities and the nuances that have started to emerge once we dive into the specifics of each of these different regulations. And now as I hand over to my colleague, Rose, who would then begin to delve into some of these complexities, I want you to hold in your mind the digital transformation story and trajectory that I've sort of laid out for you in the context of evolving data privacy regulation, and start to think about how these nuances present in your own markets as opposed to how they present in some of the other markets that you may have been exposed to, or some of the other markets or regions that we consider in the course of this presentation. So I'll stop here and hand over to Rose.
Thank you so much, Dr. Amarachi. I'll just pick up from where Amarachi's left off and speak about the gaps, projections, and the way forward. specifically when we talk about cross-border data flows. I'll start first by saying, even before I go through the overview of the regional frameworks, and there are a few, just talking about certain gaps. So at the moment, it's estimated that there is, I think, between 41 and 46 countries with data protection frameworks. However, there are 39 with standalone data protection laws, and only about 34 of them actually have regulatory authorities to oversee the implementation of those laws. And as Dr. Amarachi has mentioned, majority of these are generally fragmented, and so they have different variables when it talks about the requirements for cross-border data flows, even the data subjects' rights, the aspects on data localization, and the like. But on an overall, I guess, landscape of Africa, we'll start by talking about the African Union and the Malabo Convention of 2014. This actually does have a low ratification rate and came into force in June 2023, which is about almost 10 years, but 9 years since it was drafted. It does have a number of key principles, does talk about having a national data protection authority as well as cybersecurity laws and data protection laws. However, the enforcement mechanism is generally based on the national implementation. It does talk about transfers, but only in terms of transfers to adequate to countries with adequate protections. Again, this has had a very low uptake, and so 17 out of 54 countries is relatively low. But just on this as well, there's also the African free continental, the African free trade continental free trade agreement, and the digital trade protocol that came into effect last year, and the annexes as well that really touch on cross-border data flows and actually call for free movement of data across the continent and participating member states, and actually also look at data localization, specifically asking for there to be a lack of arbitrary rules when it comes to data localization to allow for a free flow of data, specifically when it comes to trade. And then we've got the ECOWAS, which has a supplementary act on data protection. This is binding on member states. However, there's still within the ECOWAS region countries that do not have harmonized data protection laws. And so even getting to harmonization within the ECOWAS has been something that they're working through. In SADC, they have model laws. Again, these are not binding, but they're just encouraging. They have key principles that are similar, no central enforcement mechanism. Still, again, within the SADC region, there are disparities or fragmentation when it comes to harmonized data protection laws, interpretation of adequacy, interpretation of data localization. And this is mainly based on country-specific interpretation of data protection requirements, as well as the impact on certain localization laws. And one of the things that I'll be speaking about in a slide to come. And then we have the EAC, or the East African Community. We'll go back one slide, Amaka, and then, the East African Community, which has the EAC framework for cyber laws, which was developed in 2008. However, this has never actually passed, and so we're currently drafting a regional framework that will seek harmonization based on a number of principles which are yet to be determined, and see whether there is going to be a regulatory authority. There is none as yet, and effectively what this would look at is cross-border data flows specifically, and balance the aspect of sovereignty of the partner states within the EAC, and the existing national laws. At current, I think there are out of the 8 EAC countries, there's only 6 that have data protection laws, and so this will see the other 2 that don't have data protection laws coming into the fold when it comes to cross-border data flows and the principles that would be governing data protection, specifically when it comes to cross-border data flows. And then we have COMESA as well, which again has draft laws that are not binding, that have set principles. But again, even within the countries that participate in COMESA, there is still fragmentation, and so there is no harmonization within those laws. And so this effectively just draws a map of the existing frameworks, but also paints a picture that even within the regional economic communities, or the RECs, there's still a lot of work that needs to be done to ensure that we're harmonizing laws for usage by organizations to actually ensure that there is some sort of not just standard implementation is similar. There's certainty when it comes to regulations as well, and so cross-border data flows are made a bit easier. Next slide, please. Wonderful. So I'll speak about the barriers to data flows, the capacity disparities, and the competing government priorities, but also how we can actually bridge those government priorities. I'll start with the barriers to free data flow, which is on the next slide. Wonderful. So as Amaka had touched on, there are several countries that mandate strict data localization provisions or transfer restrictions, and majority of them don't actually have guidance. And this comes from a number of reasons, not simply because of the competing government priorities. And when I talk about this, majority of the countries, and this is not just unique to the African continent, but there is an assumption that the restriction of cross-border data flows means that digital infrastructure will actually be built within those specific countries. And so rather than using economies of scale and ensuring that there's shared infrastructure, which is what the African Continental Free Trade Agreement calls for in terms of the digital trade protocol and the specifically data protection and cross-border data flows provisions, there is this understanding that if we restrict data and we say that it can't be moved from one country to another or from our country to another, then it means that there is an increase in the amount or the number of data centers within the country. It will build capacity within the country. Our data or country data is specifically more secure if it's localized, which is not necessarily the case. And so there's obviously a lack of understanding between the concept of data localization and data sovereignty, because sovereignty can happen even when the data isn't fully resident in a country. And we've seen examples of this in Estonia, using data embassies and the like to secure or as backup mechanisms to enable continuity of government business and the provision of digital services. And so having that, and that's something that needs to be debunked, has had a number of countries restrict free flow of data. Recently, we had instances where MTN Uganda and MTN Rwanda were obviously sharing data because they're effectively the same organization. Certain data was held in MTN Uganda, and there was an imposition of a fine simply because the storage was happening outside of the region, even though they serve relatively the same customer base, but also they come from the same regional economic community or regional bloc. And so these are just some of the restrictions that happen and examples of that. There's no regional adequacy mechanism. So as Amaka has mentioned, as Amarachi has mentioned, there are different definitions for what adequacy means. There's adequacy in terms of the European GDPR adequacy mechanism, where there's a step-by-step or a formal recognition that a country has essential equivalence when it comes to the same regulatory provisions. There are some that require adequacy when it comes to an assessment based on organization to organization, but there is, again, no clear reference, and each country does have again, disparities when it comes to interpretation of this, but also the requirements for adequacy. We do have some countries that don't even have the adequacy mechanism, but call for consent as a basis for a free flow of data, which in some cases is impractical. Then we do have fragmented policies, and this again spoke about this when it comes to localization, policies when it comes to ICT mandates, looking at digital transformation agenda that calls for restriction when it comes to data flows rather than looking at data flows as an increase or economic good. So if data is flowing freely out of the country and into the country, then there's room for businesses to grow, there's room for opening markets and the like. However, this is not seen as a case. Again, without looking at the limited infrastructure and trust mechanisms, this also caused a lot of issues. And so building policies because technically they're good, or this is what is deemed to be best practice. And this has been the case specifically. And again, this is just my personal view. But the adopting of laws that are not necessarily fit for purpose, but adopting them simply because they are the done thing or the global best practice without necessarily ensuring that they're done in a way that actually takes on board the cultural nuances as well as the country nuances and the regional nuances of those laws and the impact thereof. And so we've seen this when it comes to the GDPR, where a number of countries rushed to actually implement or rushed to develop laws that were very similar to GDPR, but had obviously implications because the interpretation was not the same. And we're still trying to figure out what that looks like and see how it actually applies in the African context. Regulatory ambiguity, again, there are different laws, the fragmentation. If I move my data from say Kenya to Rwanda, or Rwanda to Kenya, the risk of there being fines, because again, each of them interpret the laws differently, even though I operate within both countries, makes it very difficult for organizations to actually do business, which means that there's restrictions instead of actually increasing and meeting the ambitions of the single digital market. We'll go to the next slide. Thank you so much. When it comes to capacity disparities, this also reflects in terms of the implementation of data protection laws. And so we have some regulators that are active and staffed. So this is usually Kenya, Nigeria, South Africa, Morocco, and a number of other data protection authorities that actually are able to ensure that they're not only implementing, they have funding, they actually have the skills when it comes to staff to actually ensure that the law is being upheld and implemented in the right way. But there are some that don't have. So for example, we've got countries such as, and this again is just an example, Ghana, that has had a law since 2012, but it's reliant on actually generating its own funds or donor funding. It has I'm not saying that it's understaffed, but perhaps it needs more staff to build or to deal with the environment. And so those are some of the considerations. Not everyone has an amount of money because there's perhaps not political goodwill or a lack of understanding of what data protection is. And so there's severe underfunding. There's skills shortages as well. And this is something that happens across the board. Not only are data protection specialists or professionals a skill that is being looked for, but unfortunately, because of severe underfunding, matching the pay between the private sector and actual data protection authorities has been a problem. And this is not something that is very specific to Africa. It is something that happens within the global scope. And I think France has found a balance in which they try to match. And it's probably one of the only countries that actually does that in terms of matching somewhat to ensure that they're actually retaining talent. There is promising regional collaboration such as NADPA. However, these need scaling because ultimately at the moment, and this is a network of African data protection authorities, they do collaborate. There's a lot of sharing, but there is also underfunding, which means that the majority of what they do is just come up with strategies, but implementation is difficult in terms of coming up with frameworks for enforcement and even actual collaboration in terms of implementation of their laws, investigations, raising compliance within the region has been difficult. And so at the moment, it is a good platform for knowledge sharing, but it needs to be a bit more than that. So we'll go to the next. So one of the things that I think is important, and this comes from the aspect of competing government priorities, and again, it's not, I guess, new. There is a lot of, wars, poverty, universal healthcare, affordable housing, agricultural or food security issues, and this happens across the continent. And one of the things that needs to be really raised and pushed through is the reframing of privacy as an enabler rather than it being an additional compliance mechanism, especially now the governments are looking to, I guess, leapfrog, as the term that is commonly used, into the digital economy and leapfrog their economies actually using digital infrastructure and technology. And so privacy is an enabler. It ensures that they're able to participate not just within the continent, but also there's a trust ecosystem that allows them to participate globally and being a competing market. The aspect of privacy being an integral digital transformation, we've seen instances, and I'll speak about Kenya, where we've had, say, for example, digital ID systems that would be that have been beneficial to the community, but in the initial ideation of them, the rollout, there were no privacy considerations, which for Kenya was the reason why the Kenyan Data Protection Act was actually brought into play. And so ultimately, again, this ensures that the governments are able to effectively serve communities, but also exchange data amongst communities in a regional setting as well as a global setting. A link to privacy and economic goals. Again, touching specifically on the digital economy, we've spoken about e-commerce, we've spoken about M-Pesa, telecommunication services as well, being able to have free flow of data and have free movement of people and goods. All of this actually require the privacy aspect in it to enable trust, but also to ensure that there is a free flow of data amongst the countries within Africa. So in my view, for example, the ambition of the AFCFTA might not be achieved if there is no trust ecosystem, and specifically aspects of privacy and data protection and a secure data flows to actually supplement and have a cross-cutting support ecosystem for that. Championing data governance in high-level policy forums. You'd be surprised by the number of government officials that don't necessarily look at data governance, privacy, cross-border data flows as a priority. Specifically, they look at it as a hindrance. And so usually when it comes to even development of DPIs, for example, so digital public infrastructure systems, it's always a rush to actually deploy for the fact that they want to enable their systems, but sometimes they don't actually look at the impact of that and the interoperability in terms of scaling even outside of the countries. And data governance and data protection is one of the things that is very important. And then obviously leveraging on peer influence. So having forums where not only governments in terms of high-level governments, but also data protection authorities can actually engage and have conversations about the needs and the priorities, but also engage in aspects such as pilots where they involve private sector, which is something that the East African community is seeking to do when it comes to cross-border data flows, so that there's an understanding of the needs of the continent and not just making policies for the sake of making policies. So there is a high impact in ensuring that not just big organizations, but also small, medium enterprises are able to participate to understand, why cross-border data flows is important, the sorts of safeguards that need to be put into place to see that sort of mechanism thrive and to build a proper trust ecosystem. Next slide, please. So there are a number of projections that I see that will influence, I guess, the trajectory of cross-border data flows. The first, obviously, is the African Continental Free Trade Agreement and the Digital Trade Protocol that calls for harmonization of laws within a specific timeframe. I think that the annex that looks specifically at data protection and cross-border data flows talks about a 2 to 5 year time frame for harmonization. But again, this is a best endeavor provision. And so it's up to the countries to do what they can with the resources that they have to actually to push this aspect. There's also the expansion of adequacy agreements within the region. So I think it was announced that Kenya is participating in an adequacy negotiation between the EU and itself. And so this will actually push for countries to reevaluate their laws so that they can participate and be open to markets, not just within the African continent, but also globally. There's also growth of regional data protection authority networks. So again, as I said, with NADPA, there's a push to ensure that they've got adequate funding to then be able to provide, I guess, proper implementation as well as enforcement support to each other, and not just for the purposes of information sharing. There's also the aspect of AI governance that will actually shift how data protection authorities are looking at cross-border data flows, because ultimately with AI, there's lots of data that will be needed, and it's not data that is specifically localized to a country. And so in terms of having transparency, aspects of enforcement, even interpretation of data protection laws that are actually in place, there might actually be a push to see how laws can be changed to ensure that we are adopting AI properly, but also regulating AI in a way that needs to be done. And so, for example, we've seen countries like the UK actually amend their laws so that they can actually take into account issues such as AI. We've seen countries in the EU, for example, France, again, look at how they're interpreting the laws for the purposes of AI governance as well, and AI regulation outside of the AI Act. And so it'll be interesting for us to actually see what that would look like. But I anticipate that there might be some changes in data protection laws as well, or interpretation thereof, to accommodate this. Also, one of the things as well, I guess that has been mentioned, there's also a move for REX through different donor partners to come up with harmonized frameworks within the REX and then kind of expand that, because ultimately the ambition of the AFCFTA Digital Trade Protocol might not necessarily be able to be achieved as a whole. And so adopting that in REX and then coming to a point where the countries within those regional economic communities have harmonized laws that then feed into the digital trade protocol would be an easier way to do so. And I do know that ECOWAS and SADC are in the point of reviewing that. And again, as I mentioned, part of my work within the EAC is actually to ensure that harmonization for the purposes of ensuring a single digital market within the East African community and also the African Union. Next slide, please. Okay, so I guess one of the way forwards when it comes to this is obviously capacity building and cooperation and having formal mechanisms which data protection authorities can actually share information, support industry self-regulation. So Kenya does this in an interesting way where the law actually allows or calls for self-regulation. And so you've got associations like the Bankers Association that come into the data protection authorities to recommend, I guess, better ways in which the regulations can actually help them do business, but also protect the public generally, which means, and majority of these organizations don't only work within a specific region. So with the cooperation and self-regulation, I think that would be a increased way or a better way for collaboration generally. Improve public knowledge. Again, cross-border data flows and will not exist if there is no public trust. And so ensuring that there's actually investment into building public trust, but also investment into ensuring that people understand what compliance means, not just from a national level, but from a general level or from an African level, and the impact that would have, especially for organizations in terms of growth. strengthen cross-border regulatory coordination, which is not happening at the moment. And so there is a need for us to actually come up with mechanisms for that to happen, whether they're bound by law or otherwise. There's a need for us to have that. And then regional collaboration. Generally, we don't operate in silos. And majority of the organizations, if we're going to have a single digital market for Africa, then regional collaboration is very, very important. So there's a framework that needs to be developed to actually ensure that that's happening. I think that's the last of my slides. Go to the next one, perhaps. Yep. So I'll finish there and just, ensure that, I guess that the main point is just ensuring that we do have a unified ecosystem when it comes to cross-border flows and data protection to build that trust ecosystem. Otherwise, everything kind of falls on the wayside if we don't have those strong structures in place. So I'll give it back to Amaka. Thank you.
Thank you, Rose and Dr. Amarachi, for those really insightful presentations. And I think we're going to continue the conversation with a few questions, quick fire questions, if you don't mind. But one thing I would like to say is, given how you've highlighted the need for knowledge and the skills gap, that not just with regulatory authorities, but also with people themselves, they might consider possibly our DPO foundation course here, where it seems like a foundation course, and I've actually attended it, and I was actually surprised that it's something, as a practicing DPO, I found to be really insightful and helpful with my actual activities as a DPO. So it's something that I think people might consider also looking into, and might help them, not just DPOs, but regulatory authorities as well. But moving on to the questions, to you, Dr. Amarachi. Africa's digital landscape is evolving quickly. What do you see as the biggest challenges organizations face when managing transborder data flows on the continent?
Three things come to mind. The first would be there's a very clear reliance on certain countries when it comes to data and critical infrastructure, right? So Nigeria, South Africa, Kenya are sort of thought of as the go-to places for a lot of the hyperscalers, but that's just three out of a massive continent which has a lot of need, a lot of demand, and a lot of capacity for development and evolution. And so I think moving away from this sort of this pattern of dependency on the big players and starting to see the entire continent as ripe for innovation will be critical. Enforcement, as Rose mentioned, is a critical area for development, enabling data protection authorities to actually enforce the regulations in a way that the organizations that are working in these spaces respect will be critical. And skills and capacity building, making sure that we have, again, something that Rose touched on quite a bit, making sure that we are building ourselves up as both individually as economies within the continent and collaboratively as countries together, working together to train and give agency to those who have both the desire and the capability to push a lot of the enforcement frameworks that we are hoping and we are advocating for. We're hoping for and advocating for. So those are the three things that come to mind.
Okay. And to you, Rose, those three countries keep popping up. So I'll just ask, the regulatory landscapes in Nigeria, Kenya, and South Africa have striking differences. How do these impact multinational countries handling personal data across borders, and what advice would you give for navigating these complexities?
Absolutely. So, it's it's really interesting when I worked as a regulator, understanding how multinationals were, some, not all, some multinationals would actually navigate this would be sometimes just to do what is required. But in terms of, say, if there's registration requirements, they would kind of just skip through those and implement whatever would be the strictest data protection framework, which majority of them would assume if I've dealt with GDPR, then I'm good with all the other African countries, right? And so you would find that many a times you'd be battling to say, okay, fine, but even though you're dealing with GDPR, there's still a requirement for you to look at what's happening on the continent and comply with the requirements within the continent. And one of I guess the differences when it comes to cross-border data flows, luckily for these particular for these particular countries that have been mentioned, there is a difference in interpretation, but ultimately in terms of the requirements for cross-border data flows, the aspects of adequacy, the aspects of safeguards, the aspects of, I guess, technical and organizational safeguards or contractual agreements are relatively similar. And so what advice I would give in terms of navigating, one would be to engage the regulators to understand what the requirements are and not just ignore simply because they're a smaller market, which a number of multinationals tend to want to do. Two would obviously be to do the same thing that they would do in any market, which would be to look at the stricter application of the different laws and kind of align to the complexities of that and kind of engage regulators to make them understand that this is what we're actually doing when it comes to implementing cross-border data transfer safeguards and the like. But three is, and again, I have touched on this, there is a push for harmonization and change. And I think the third thing when it comes to navigating complexities would actually be for them to take action to bring to the fore some of the issues that they're having when it comes to cross-border data flows and the difficulties. So, for example, within the East African community, this is something that we're doing where we'll be engaging multinationals as well as SMEs to understand what the implications of the fragmented laws are, so that we could actually build and rephrase and reframe the existing laws to enable not just the smaller businesses, but also the larger businesses to operate in a way that enables seamless cross-border data transfers, but still protect the individuals. And so investing a lot in regulator education as well for them, but just ensuring that they're bringing to the fore verbally their concerns with existing frameworks so that we can better the frameworks within the African context is very important. So that's my recommendation for those, and those are specifically from a policy and regulatory sphere, but I think they're very important for us to take note of.
Okay, but then in that sense, it would seem like harmonization of laws and between different countries would somewhat make things better, wouldn't it?
That's 100%.
And with regional frameworks like the African Union's Malabo Convention and initiatives from ECOWAS and SADC, with their aim to harmonize data protection, what's your view on how effective those efforts are? And what remains as the greatest barrier to that continent-wide alignment?
Okay. So first I'll start by saying with the African Union Malabo Convention as it is, I personally feel like it is an outdated framework. Again, it was developed in 2014. The provisions when it comes to data protection specifically are a bit lax, and so there needs to strengthen so that they actually meet international best practice. I do know that there are efforts to review the Malabo Convention, and so maybe that will be coming up in place, and perhaps the uptake will be a bit higher. But I think we are now looking to see how exactly we can actually do this in terms of African Continental Free Trade Agreement. I think that is the priority at the moment, not necessarily the Malabo Convention or the regional laws, but how can ECOWAS, SADC, EAC develop their laws so that they're kind of feeding into the greater ambition of the Digital Trade Protocol and AFCFTA, and find a balance between, I guess, economic growth and the protection of citizens' rights and the like. And so one of the things that I see to be the biggest barrier when it comes to continental-wide agreement is that there is a push for us to just move all at once, and we can't do that. And so how it's being tackled within the regional blocks, just looking at what works best and kind of coming to a way where we're sharing information as regional blocks and working together, and I do know that this is happening, might actually make sure that we're moving together and we're moving, the harmonization is kind of being seen as, okay, fine, we've tested in one regional block and this is how it looks like and this is how we'll do it. Another thing that I think is a greatest barrier is majority, again, and I think I mentioned this in my presentation, there is this, I don't know whether it's a lack of trust amongst the countries, and obviously there's a lot of geopolitics that happens within the African continent, as there is generally, but there is this lack of trust that if, say, for example, and this is just an example, if Kenya builds infrastructure, then it can be used by East Africa and it can serve the East African community. Or if Nigeria builds, and it could be used by West African countries and the like. And so there's this feel that if we give up that build aspects of infrastructure, then we're giving up some of our economic power, and we're giving up their ability to actually, have that infrastructure built into the country. But that's not the case. So an example is that I think last year, Kenya announced that one of the multinational companies was going to build a green data center in Kenya. This would ultimately serve not just Kenya, but East African community and the globe, right? But if you were to speak to a country within the actual region and say, well, why don't you have your data actually served or stored in the green data center? They would say, well, no, why doesn't that multinational company come and build in my country as well? Right? Which makes no practical sense. So again, I think the understanding or the lack of understanding about the implications financially, economically, but also the interpretations of digital data localization, data sovereignty, to understand that having and building that trust ecosystem and ensuring that infrastructure can actually be shared is something that will benefit not just a country that has the infrastructure, but also a country that is utilizing the infrastructure to actually build off whatever is already existing. But for us to do that, again, there's a need for coordination. Another thing that is actually also a barrier is that when it comes to even having harmonized laws, unless there is an enforcement mechanism that is actually put into place and a body that is put into place to actually ensure that enforcement is coordinated and interpretation is coordinated, even if we did have harmonized laws, interpretation would be fragmented. And so there's a need to also consider that even as we move forward, because that could also be a hindrance, even if we do have those harmonized data protection regulations or frameworks.
Oh, wow. Quite a big bit there. But then that means a lot of laws would need to be changed and in multiple places. And given the diversity and fast-changing nature of laws, then what are some practical approaches or best practices you would recommend to ensure compliance and reduce operational risk in cross-border activities? Dr. Amarachi, that one's for you.
Well, I guess that's the crux of what we're debating here, right? I guess not debating, but trying to examining here. Of course, there's no silver bullet for this, right? I think organizations just have to be really agile, right? You cannot be a monolith. You cannot assume that we're in compliance now, we're in compliance forever. But at the same time, you cannot have, there's a mantra that I keep at the back of my mind every day, when I engage with my stakeholders as whether it's as privacy counsel, as product counsel, is don't throw out the baby with the bathwater, right? Don't be so strict that you can't do business, but don't be so risk averse that you're exposing your company to litigation left, right, and center, right? So what is that sweet spot? that spot changes, the goalpost keeps changing, right? And so it's really important to, when you think about privacy, to not just think about regulatory compliance, but to think of privacy operations. What does that mean? How can you translate the policies and the regulations into real, what it means in real life when you're working in an organization that's trying to make money, right? And trying to do business. And so this involves everything from, we talk about risk-based approaches all the time. And I know it's sort of a catchphrase, but it that's really what it is, right? Not throwing out the baby with the bathwater, is really understanding where your pain points are. That is, where does the highest level of risk sit or lie, and make sure that you're navigating those areas appropriately. But there are other areas where the risk might not be as great, and being able to titrate your privacy operations in a way that you're addressing the most critical risks in the right way, and not over indexing on business operations that involve personal data where the level of risk is not as high. And so in order to do that, you have to really understand your data. You have to have really good data governance where you're classifying your data in the right way that allows you to make business decisions in sort of a risk forward way. And so implementing sort of tiered data classification systems that account for the different levels of risk within the organization and the different levels of regulatory exposure is really important, right? You have compliance frameworks that are adapted and that are adaptive in a way that they can shift and meld to account for different levels of risk depending on the data that you're discussing and that's in play, right? Secondly, understanding your markets is really important, right? There's some markets that are riskier than others. There's some markets that are that are stricter in terms of the way that they apply their privacy regulatory frameworks, right? And depending on the jurisdiction that you're working in, you as an organization need to understand how those local contexts would apply to your business, and how to enforce, or how those different contexts enforce the privacy regulatory frameworks that they have in place, if they do have them in place, right? And having a really good understanding of your markets, which means that you need to have people on the ground, right? You can't be a multinational sitting somewhere and think that you're going to sit somewhere in France or in the US or wherever and understand what's happening on the ground in terms of privacy regulation and how that's evolving, right? In practice, not just what's on the books, but what's actually happening in practice. So having your finger on the pulse of what's happening on the ground and using that as a way to advise the way you're doing business within those markets is really important. Understand your markets. And thirdly, understanding how those different regulations can translate into compliance matrices within your organization. And what does that mean, right? What are your where is your data? Where does it sit? Do you have your records of processing? Have you done all your ROPAs, right? Who's using the data? Who's accessing it? What sort of security protocols do you have? What sort of encryption protocols do you have? Like really understanding the actual practicalities of compliance when it comes to how data moves and the data architecture within your organization. So it's really privacy operations, and it's very different from just understanding the regulation. That's part one. But understanding how it applies within an organizational context and working with stakeholders, understanding the different priorities and incentives of the different stakeholders, influencing people when you're not their boss, you're not their manager, you're telling them how to create their products in a privacy protective way. And these are engineers that have deadlines, that have product timelines, right? Trying to work as a privacy professional within an organization in a way that's efficient and effective and aligning with privacy regulation is a whole different ballgame. So being able to understand that as a privacy professional, I think is really critical as a way to reduce operational risk.
Wow. Insightful. So to keep with time, we're going to just try to wrap all this up. If there's any questions from the audience, it'll be nice to just get something from people outside this panel here. Otherwise, we'll need to then try wrap up and get people back to their activities. Oh, okay. We have Florida Musi. Okay. How can companies build trust among its citizens, especially companies that are currently using quantum computing in their tech operations? The fact that quantum computers collect personal data even intentionally. I'm not sure if they are actually operational yet, but
I guess that's what I was about to say. This is emerging technology, right? It's
yeah,
brand spanking new. I mean, even where the technology is being created, people are running around like chickens with their heads cut off. They don't even know how to manage the amount of data that's being collected and processed, even tracking where that data is going and getting the right consents in place, right? What are people even consenting to? They don't know, because once that data is fed into the model, it's very difficult to track what it will be used for, where it will go, right? And how do you get consent for an AI model or machine learning model that's going to be used in perpetuity for any and everything, right? And it's going to be fed into these large LLMs, right? That's an emerging area, and that's an area that I think we as privacy professionals have a responsibility to, I think, to continue to keep track of the technology, so we understand how we can influence regulations and policies that are intended to match the pace of this technology if they can. That's just the reality.
true. And let's not forget, it's not just regulators and DPOs who influence change. It's also everyone who's privacy aware.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's all about learning.
Yeah.
And as long as you are willing to change and learn about change, you will also be able to influence change itself. Last one from Irene. How practical is consent as a safeguard for trans-border data transfer, especially in the underprivileged communities in Africa? I think we'll ask Rose. She's from the regulator side.
Used to be, not
Used to be.
I don't believe that consent is meant to be a safeguard. Consent is meant to be an enabler to transborder data transfer, and so even as consent being an enabler, there is a need for organizations to still ensure that they have technical and organizational safeguards, or they're transferring to a country that has essential equivalence when it comes to data protection laws and things like this. So consent is only meant to be, I guess, a tool where you inform individuals to enable transparency, I guess, from individuals, and enable them to understand why exactly it is that you're transferring the data, the sorts of protections that you'll put into place. In countries like Kenya, for example, one of the things that is required is the ability to actually inform the data subject to the individual as to the risks of the transfer. And so I guess in that respect, then, the aspect of transparency and informed decision making can be made. How practical is consent in underprivileged communities? I think this is just an imbalance that I think exists generally, and so I do feel that sometimes underserved or underprivileged communities might not necessarily understand what they're consenting to, and it is the obligation of the company to really state it in layman's terms, or in terms that is actually understandable to the communities themselves, to understand not just the impacts, but also the advantages of this transfer of data. But again, that is an ethical responsibility that is upon the individual, the individual organization themselves, and this is something that they need to be doing. But consent is by no means a safeguard when it comes to transported data transfers.
Thank you. Well, with that, we're going to be wrapping up. We'd like to offer our greatest thanks to Rose and Dr. Amarachi. You guys have offered us so much of your time, and let's give all that knowledge and experience. It's something that isn't easy to come by, and we're so grateful for you to take your time to share it with us here. Do either of you have any last words before? No. So I'd like to say thank you for everything. I'll just give final announcements. Everyone attending will be getting their $20 in virtual DP in their wallets. And that can be used for any of the courses that are available on DPO Africa Network. Later today, we will have office hours. That's at 3 p.m. WAT, 4 p.m. SAST, 5 p.m. EAT. And during office hours, you're free to ask questions highlighting anything that might have been highlighted on things that were highlighted today. And you're free to ask anything else relating to privacy or anything relating to tech. With that, we say thank you, and it was good to have you on the webinar, and goodbye.